mean, I think probably the first thing that we need to acknowledge is there's good reason for people to feel grief and anxiety and fear. And this is a pretty unusual situation. And it's taken away a lot of the things that we normally depend on to deal with our anxiety, the security of our work, the security of our health and fitness and so on and so forth. One of the things that I think that does happen in times like this is that your use of spirituality and your use of scripture is expanded because you're beginning to ask questions of scripture and tradition that you weren't asking before. It's a little bit like when Walter Brueggemann talks about the Psalms, and he has a typology where he says the royal Psalms are those times in life when everything's going really well. And God's in his heaven and this hallelujah celebration is fantastic. But then something happens to disrupt that, and you go into this post-purpose period of disorientation. So there are Psalms talk about orientation, everything's perfect in the world. Disorientation is when everything falls apart. And all the maps that used to help you to make sense of the world, all the signs and pointers no longer do that. And at these points, he says, the Psalms of Lament begin to speak into that situation. And I think that one of the problems that we may have for many of us is that we don't practice lamenting regularly. It's not like there's not enough in the world to lament. We don't necessarily have the language that we can articulate our faith and all this anxiety and fear in a time like this.
The way that I look at lament is a can opener for us to be in touch with the realities that we experience as human beings. And as a matter of fact, we often fast forward from Good Friday to Easter Sunday, and we ignore Holy Saturday, where Holy Saturday is an odd entity for those of us in the church. What do we talk about? When it comes to Holy Saturday, we do not understand that ambiguity. Where was Jesus? What happened to him? And I often wonder how people make sense of that Holy Saturday, because they were mourning, they were in grief on Holy Saturday. And I think this tells us this is real. They went through it in difficult times, and we're going through this our everyday life. We don't just fast forward from death to resurrection in a nanosecond. Lament gives us, if I can say, the language and the culture to be in touch with a huge part of who we are in our imago Dei, in our image of God, and that is the sadness, like even the anger of God is part of lament, and that allows us to be in touch with who we are, and I think that hopefully this gives us a language to understand ourselves differently, and that will help us face our mortality a lot differently than what we used to.
When you listen to the psalmist, the psalmist very often is terrified because God's not doing what God says he will do. God doesn't seem to be faithful to the covenant. God doesn't seem to be taking him out of this pit, out of this mire, and he just gets absolutely lost. And it's the language of the psalm that's really, really interesting because they're honest, they're straightforward. They get angry, the psalmist gets angry at God, he gets frustrated, he articulates his sadness. Brueggemann says that after the period of disorientation, which actually very often took place in small groups within the temple for people who had been particularly traumatized, interestingly, to give them a language to express an experience. After the disorientation, you have reorientation. You come back to a place where things are more back under control and God is more under control. So now we have to learn that language for the moment so that we can articulate how we're feeling at the moment and look toward the future, but at the same time realizing the future is not going to be like the past. God's going to be doing things, but it will be new things. And these new things will be quite different and perhaps quite dissonant, but will certainly be happening. So I think the Psalms is a good place to begin.
I found a very helpful model about the healing value of tears, mostly within attachment and aggression research. And some early work in aggression research, this is done way before, sort of between World War I and World War II, was Dollard and Miller formulated a frustration aggression hypothesis to make sense of depression. That aggression is turned inward and it becomes a depression, or it can go outward and become an act of violence. And we saw the biggest act of violence on the world stage in World War I and II. And so that was the wrestling that was happening at the time that research. That model was built on by Gordon Neufeld, and he's an attachment-based developmental psychologist. And he's worked on the premise that yes, there's frustration underlying all of our lives. Grand levels of frustration, but also lots of myriad small frustrations. And right now, on a global scale, we are facing the biggest frustration we've ever experienced since. And that means a myriad layers of loss that comes with all the things that we cannot change about this situation. And so Gordon Neufeld's model says when we're facing extreme frustration, and frustration is an existential emotion all humans face, we can either change our circumstances on the outside, adapt, which is change on the inside, or attack. And the key thing that would keep us from attacking is finding our deep tears of futility and living soft-hearted in this world.
So my personal model, the way that I often reference or make sense of grief, is simply by saying grief is the presence of absence. That there was something, someone, and that is no longer there. The two models that I really enjoy working with in my clinical practice are the dual process model, which came out in about the 90s, and again, another model that came out in the 90s called continuing bonds. And so dual process model looks at these two ways of responding to pain. One is loss oriented, and is really about feeling the ache and the sadness and the emptiness that comes with the loss. And the other way is meaning oriented. And sometimes meaning orientation can look like finding purpose or distracting yourself. It could even be around kind of shifting gears and saying, well, I'm going to focus on tasks. And so instead of us moving in a linear fashion, stepwise through stages, the dual process model says, actually for most of our life, we're moving back and forth between those. And what's helpful about the dual process model is that it reminds us that it's okay to move back and forth. That if one day we're feeling like, I'm actually really enjoying the sunny day, and then the next day we're in the grocery store weeping because something that we see reminds us of someone that we love who is gone, that doesn't mean you're regressing, and that isn't a pathology. It's just the natural process of moving back and forth. And then there's the continuing bonds model, which has been helpful for us in kind of making room for the way that attachments are ongoing. So in the first model of grieving that I proposed to you, which looked at grieving as a process of being with pain until your attachments to whoever is deceased no longer exists, continuing bond says your relationship with them will never end, even if they're not with you. And so continuing bond says it's okay over time to have an ongoing connection with that person. And that doesn't mean that you're broken or you have complicated grief or that you're depressed or you're broken in some ways. But it's really about saying, whenever we have a relationship with someone, they become woven into our sense of identity in a way that we always carry them with us. So what's helpful about these specific models is it creates just some space and some room to say, it's okay if there's an enduring process for you. And grief isn't some sort of stage model that you have to pass through in order to be healthy. My assumption is that grief is extremely painful and that most of us don't know how to feel pain. And so we write our cultural discourse into the way that we read and understand scripture and the way that we do church. I think it is ideal that most of us see our primary identity as being within the church. But in doing so, we minimize the impact that our social, our cultural, our historical place impacts how we move as bodies, how we feel, and our permission to be with that or not. And so grief is disruptive, right? Especially if our story around faith is that it must be, as followers of Jesus, we need to primarily be joyful. Then it would be dissonant for us to make room for our pain. I say that the way that I look at scripture is that there's actually so much room in our Christian tradition for lament and grief and pain and not knowing and uncertainty and suffering. But when our culture has said, don't feel pain, it is so much easier to choose scriptural references that support that and say, no, we must be joyful all the time. And what happens is we just end up neglecting the richness of life and all of these entry points within which God can come in and be with us.
Particularly for those of us who are charismatic evangelicals, is that sometimes we implicitly or explicitly associate happiness and a lack of anxiety with faithfulness. So we think when the scripture talks about us counting it all as joy, we think we've got to be happy, we've got to be, always looking positively at things. But actually, the way that, if you look at the Gospels, the way that joy is articulated, it includes suffering. It includes sadness, it includes brokenness, it includes happiness. But when Paul talks about counting it all as joy, it's not count it all as happiness. Because happiness is never named as a gift of the Spirit, but joy is. So I think that we just sometimes implicitly or explicitly make that association, and then when we feel broken or afraid and anxious, we think, I'm losing my faith or I'm being unfaithful. But actually, all of these emotions are captured in the Gospels. And actually, all of these emotions are captured in the life of Jesus. So if we read the scriptures in times of anxiety, we'll be surprised how much we can identify with what goes on within the Gospel, the story of Jesus.
I think our pain is the doorway to God. I really do believe that. And so when we neglect our pain, we're also saying there are rooms in the house of our lives that God cannot enter, that we cannot enter. And we're missing an opportunity for there to be even more fullness and richness and depth in our spiritual walk.
I actually believe the Trinity weeps with us. Actually, they're leaning in deeply to our tears of loss. And actually bringing this image, I guess, comes from the Psalms of bringing a bottle and collecting all of our tears, because they know each of those tears are precious. Each of those tears represents something we value that has been lost. We value our autonomy, our agency. We value our freedom. But I also gain great comfort from the part in Isaiah and Revelation where it says, the day will come when all of our tears will be wiped away, and all this suffering will be over, and there will be no more pestilence stalking the planet. So I've got to hold all that tension of living right here in my raw grief and holding that eschatological hope. And don't ask me how you do it. I'm still figuring that piece out.
We need to have hope in Jesus. And that's very important. Even, through our physical suffering and death, that our ultimate hope is in Jesus. And he's the only one that can give us that hope after the resurrection of Jesus. He appeared to his disciples and inside a home, and the disciples were overjoyed when they heard when they saw the resurrected Lord. And I thought it was very comforting for them to recognize that someone that who they thought had died, and that was it. And they were able to recognize there's a renewed hope. Everything makes sense to them at that moment. Like everything, the tabernacle, the cross, the cup, the bread, everything Jesus talked about makes sense to them. And I think this gave me a lot of comfort, knowing that we don't have all the answers. Most people would ask the suffering question during this time. And I always tell people, I don't have an answer of the suffering question, because who am I to speak into your life that you lived for that many years and try to make sense of suffering and what you're going through. But I know one thing, and that is, even beyond the suffering, there is hope, and there is that joy that we will see in the resurrected Lord. And I think that brings comfort to those that are in grief as they think about, one, this will all happen to us. We will be one day be all resurrected. And two, that even in this transitional time that we're in as human beings, children of God, we're not there yet. We are seeing that possibility and that reality that will come, the parousia, right? In Greek, where it's coming, but it's also here.
Well, it's a lot to hold, and I think it's hard to, one of the things I think about bereavement in general is that there are certain ways we understand it, and we manage it around certain traditions, and we have certain roles in it, certainly those who are in ministry. And at a time like this, that gets very disrupted. We know the loss is here, but there isn't the expectation of how others can help us. And I think there is a challenge in ministry in that way. There's a challenge of how we do it as a community. And further on from this, the grief course, do take a look if you'd like to. We're actually just releasing an Advent resource which talks about the journey of lament to gratitude. So I'll just share a quick slide on that, if I can find it. I think I can, which will show you what that looks like. It's something that we've written for the UK. Well, I've written it with help from the team over in Canada to make it look nice, amongst other things. But this is very much about that process of kind of recognizing that it can be difficult to come to terms with these different experiences, and that actually within our tradition there's a lot of wonderful content. And so what this resource does, it's for really over the course of an evening to help people kind of name the things that have been lost to them, and to support people through that, but also think about, well, what does this mean at this time when we look to kind of Christmas hope, we look to Christ with us, and look beyond this period. What does that look like? So do take a look. It's officially launching tomorrow. So if you go onto the website, you'll see it there, and I'm sure we can send a link round to you as well. I'm sure we could do that, Mark, if people are interested in that. And if you're interested in continuing to kind of follow the work that we're doing and find other ways that we can resource you and stay in contact with me, that's a really good way to do it. So I know we've, again, on all this, it feels like every topic we've looked at today, you always feel like you're just skimming the surface, even though we've done an awful lot. But I hope that, I've enjoyed this time, and I've really appreciated your contribution and everything you brought. So thank you. Thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed being here. So hang on, we're 7 minutes over, Mark. I do apologise. I said it would only be 5, but there we are. We'll land it at that, shall we?